An honor to be here. And clearly, as was just given the example of, this is going to be a very low tech presentation. So, what I'm going to talk about a couple things. Um, I'm going to talk about the concept of Makudzu, which is my studio's philosophical core. Um, when I was growing up in the South, there was this vine, the kudzu vine, which was introduced after the war to control erosion. But it was discovered that it grew on top of everything. It grew on top of jumped over roads, grew on power lines, deconstructed buildings. So I turned to the idea that in a lot of architecture, in a lot of sort of modern society, that I see this uncontrolled growth layer of mechanical kudzu, or a topography of technology that starts to infiltrate and erode kind of basic human conditions. And so that is the essence of what my studio is about. So I'm going to talk today about the culture of technology and the technology of culture, at least as it relates to architectural and representation, and then a condition that I've generated that's called annotative space as it relates to my work. So I've written two books. They both deal with this idea of the culture of technology and the technology of culture, that I think has specifically now started to arise from the saturation of computation technology and the condition of the screen. So a little bit of a backstory. When I was very young, I was in Cub Scouts. We did an exercise where we each got like a 12 by 12 square of ground that they roped off with twigs and yarn. And our task was to observe everything that we could, documenting it on a pad of paper. And I remember, and I was very young, after about 5 minutes, I became very bored and thought, for an hour, what is there to see here for an hour? But as I spent a little bit more time with it, I realized there was this incredibly thick magnitude of densities. There were lots of different kinds of bugs, each doing their own thing. There was this incredible variety of twigs and bits of bark, large amounts of dead plant residue, which offered kind of a great color variety. There were bits of dandelion spore heads, definitely a system of insect traffic dynamics, and even tiny pieces of trash. Not to mention the soil itself, which is kind of an indefinite collection of sizes and colors. And then there was the grass. Each blade, although it would seem to be the same, was quite unique in shape, state, color, and texture, and even different stages of growth. And I also started paying attention to the edges of the yarn and these twig columns that were used to define the square, even though it wasn't part of the assignment. And so it was, to say the least, a very eye-opening experience. The purpose of the exercise was obviously to promote observation and analysis to a very young and impressionable mind. So this exercise of observation has stuck with me. Given the fact that we now live in a world of tech immersion, we're constantly absorbed in our own interface of personal scale devices. We've even begun to alter our posture to allow for kind of multiple navigational systems, the screen and whatever else. And I think in our consumption, we are consumed by the act of removal, where removals remove themselves from certain societal interactions by the inability to exist in the moment. So we're no longer observing those crude squares of twine and sticks. We're now focused on screens, which remove us from the here and now of our geographical, our spatial, and our emotional experience. We've become so concentrated on the somewhere other, we've forgotten about the here. So, when we check our email, as some of you might be doing right now, or we're on social media, our presence, our consciousness, our presence no longer exists in the physical space. Instead, we exist in what I like to call a digital non-space. It's some place other than where we are. I think we're drowning in radio waves and Wi-Fi signals, invisible thoughts and conversations that create an incredibly dense, almost impenetrable web of transmitted data. And for my work, I like to imagine kind of what that physical space might look like if we could start to visualize these ever constant data fields. So a little bit of background, a couple of influences. I talked about the kudzu vine, some samples you can see here. And grew up in the South. I saw lots of old tobacco warehouses and brick buildings being eroded. It was fantastic. And I was also influenced. I was an avid comic book reader when I was very young. There was an artist. It was one of the founders of Marvel Comics, Jack Kirby. He created these background machine mega machines, and he had this kind of a world machine language. I think what's interesting that both of these things, the machine language of Jack Kirby and the kudzu vine, they're things that were happening in the background. They were elements that weren't the central characters of either story. But I think both of them played kind of an important role in the formation of my design narrative. I've become very interested in things that are happening in the background and trying to make them visible and bringing them into the foreground. So with the culture of technology, you've got this kind of collective mass consumption belief and a dependency on the system and distribution of mass media. It's kind of a blind faith to the gods of tech. It's mainly a software dependent cloud that masquerades as a hardware manifestation. You know, the iPad, the iPhone, Instagram, TikTok, reality TV, fake news, it's all humanity transcended. And we've started to create, especially those of you who are here in Southern California, yeah, you'll recognize these kind of this invisible technology transmitted through these not so invisible devices. I call them ubiquitous furtive objects, UFOs. These UFOs start to obliterate our landscape unnoticed. And we see them here in the slide. It's easy to say, yes, I recognize that. But when you're scouring the landscape, they just start becoming background. And that starts to become the technology of culture. And we start to measure these through the metrics of what I call technology vents that are becoming more and more overwhelmingly a part of our physical world. And ironically, we paid little attention to the physicality of these events, the screens themselves. We've either been taught to, or we have become more likely desensitized to these physical markers and the cues of these events as the technology of culture. It teaches us to accept versus analyze, to assume versus confirm, and to absorb versus create. And we really can't escape this culture. And I think in most cases, we don't want to. It's addictive, it's immersive, it's absolute. And it has been said that what you attempt to deny, you only make stronger. And yeah, it's really hard to imagine our lives not worshiping in this culture of tech that we have built. It has been said that God has created man in his own image, but I think it might be that humankind has in fact created God in his image, and that image is being transmitted through our smartphones. The screen, therefore, I think may very well be the new altar in this temple of tech culture. So when you shift into what my work, what I do, I think when you view it through these technological vents, it's about the saturation of data, and this leads to the visualization of those control points, those markers, and those distribution devices of that data. And so now we start to shift from the technology of culture to the culture of technology. It's the infrastructure and the distribution of devices that project culture. It's an artificial organic system of recording and documentation. And so these artifacts, the hardware and the overlay are of the two are experienced through things like touchscreen ordering, the stock exchange feed, jumbotron screens. You guys were just talking about AI. That's part of it. I think my work conceptually is not only about those sets of infinite invisible data being transmitted by the world, but those aforementioned control points and transmission systems. And this is what I have kind of labeled notational space. It's kind of about working between the lines, but perhaps more so by making visible that kind of limbotic space that we experience but are tuned out of on a daily basis. Maybe think of it as kind of like an AR device for constructing and reading drawings. So I'm going to reference just a few of the projects from my latest book to discuss some of the ideas behind the work and this concept. So the first is the syntaxonome. So this is an architectural experiment that informs and constructs its own internal satellite dialogue as well as its own synthetic contexts. So the syntaxonome kind of occupies this space and state between the entity and its constructs, kind of the space between a model and its drawings, if you're familiar with the architectural process. It's the syntax of its taxonomy, the structure of its internal grammar is it's more than a casual reference to the orthographic projection system. And the notation that this object can project its own graphic notation and annotation system as it is being constructed. So typically we would create an object and we would annotate it after. This is an object that as it's constructing itself, it's constructing its own annotation system during that actual live time. It started out as what's actually the entity itself is kind of a communique housing. It's a drawing apparatus, and it's also a communication field. It's a transcription device. It's based on political ramifications of a very outdated and pre-email inter-office communication, the envelope, combined with architectural tools of expression and documentation, such as the Leroy lettering guide, which was an archaic method that we used to draw letters on top of drawings to get them uniform. So if we get back to this envelope idea, there's this implied social hierarchy that used to exist within architecture offices that was perfectly illustrated from this inter-office memo. It was this envelope it was incredibly public and an incredibly exclusionary artifact or broadcast. So it kind of took the form of these clandestine documents, but it had a graphic social sting of their intrinsic exclusionary configurations. So this envelope was passed around with people's names on it. It was in plain view in the office mail run, where subordinates or people that weren't as important were expressively left off of these secretive papers, which was started to create and reinforce this void within office tiered politics. And so some of these images, these early graphic prototypes of the syntaxonome drawings evolved this idea of taking that hierarchy and kind of flattening this partisan organization through a very unfiltered and uncensored broadcast of the proprietary project data. And it started chasing out just a fraction of the relationships and the behavior coding that resided in an apparatus that, again, both makes drawings and inhabits the projected theoretical world of those graphic communications at the same time. It turned out to be an opportunity to see if the residual two-dimensional drawing had capabilities or capacities that might project back into the physical third dimension of the mechanism. So these graphic reservoirs then they're receptacles, they're repositories of data that's generated through the act or the search of drawing, serving as a verb of action, of speculation, and assumption. And so they're the projected ambitions of the project and its residual graphic output, which is to generate a set of architectural conditions, selected drawn components. It's a replicator, but it has the ability to edit as it introduces kind of a mimicking process. So it's neither all drawing nor is it all model, but it definitely is all media. So the next project, the DC-19. So this was a response to COVID-19. It's important. The sketch problem was conceived of during that initial lockdown period at the beginning of COVID. So I have a quote here for you. In big cities around the world, people eyed each other warily over face masks, moving to the edges of the sidewalk, hugging the entryway to buildings, letting the elevator pass rather than join other passengers in a confined space. Meanwhile, hundreds of millions of people, including many architects, were confronting the inadequacies of their own domestic spaces. Small apartments clustered around empty event spaces and workout rooms that were no longer safe to use, with laundry available only in the basement. Open plan suburban houses with vast interiors lacked sufficient partitions to keep people with the virus apart from those without it. As weeks of isolation turned into months, and as the fear of a rise in infections grew with the approach of summer, these inadequacies seemed to forge a new consensus, not fully articulated but widely felt, that architecture is about rights, architecture is about air, and architecture is about equal access to the necessities of life. So again, this was a direct response to the condition of lockdown. Most of us had this forced isolation in the 19 and 20, the result of this sudden global impact of the virus. And more directly, I think the project became an exploration about the redefinition of architectural interaction. It's the manner in which we temporarily redefined social interface and physical space. And so the study's not, it was not a typical house. It wasn't about construction cost, and it wasn't about socioeconomic equities, which are important. It concerned itself with an inquiry to the functions of a world where social distancing and the mechanics of clean air exchange would be discussed as kind of a new prototypology. And again, remember, this was designed in 2019. It also began to explore issues of potential post-COVID domestic conditions before we knew what those were going to be. Physical isolation, social segregation, cognizant air filtering, and more importantly, home delivery services that served as a primary method of societal engagement and physical human interaction. I know I struck up a relationship with my UPS guy because he was visiting my house every couple of days, dropping stuff off in my driveway, and we would have a conversation. And so this worldwide event, to me, started to reshape a large extent to how we might project our domestic constructs, both physical and metaphorical. And so, for example, as I just mentioned, the front yard, the driveway, the entry court, which once was a semi-public gathering space, started to become an apparatus of mechanical segregation and sequestration. It became an architectural filter. It shifted from a place of assembly to a place of exclusion and separation. And where it traditionally, at least my front yard, had been an option for friendly community exchanges with neighbors and intimate conversations, it became a place of ceremony and curation. It started to function as a buffer zone. It became this barricaded fortress of a medical necessity. It was still open to the sky and still a prologue to the domestic facade. The front yard moved the access point from the door to the walled perimeter, kind of a gated palisade. The entry threshold was expanded from a couple of inches to many, many yards in order to provide the only entity that seemed at the time to prevent viral spread, this aloofness of unpopulated airspace. And then it also obviously became a political device, as neighbor was often pitted against neighbor based on politics or their beliefs of the science behind needed filtration and the science of communicable disease infections. It became your yard versus my yard, your space versus my space. And if you distill it all down, it became your air versus my air. So speaking of air, then we'll go into the next one, the ozonic metric anomaly. So this started as kind of a conceptual space as a protective layering, and it started to inquire as to how that might be recognized, labeled, and then re-imaged within this age of media saturation and resource deflation. So originally it was a proposal for plugging the ozone system, and it merged with the reduction of our needed protective stratum with the accumulation of data space, responding to this demand for the aggregation of bandwidth that we all need. So it really became a conversation of skins and projections. So it looked at the Earth's atmospheric skin, it looked at the human skin, it looked at the skin of architecture, I looked at the membrane of social media engagement, and then the projection of information, which is the recording, the reporting, and the forecasting of current scenarios. So when I relocated to Los Angeles in 1988, I think there were only two main area codes for the surrounding territories. Mobile phones were quite an anomaly. Fax machines were just starting to enter the consumer market, were still kind of a novelty. The web as a consumer accessible entity really hadn't been born. I think currently that number of area codes from that same Los Angeles, Orange County region has gone from 2 to around 15 or 16, depending on what your district mapping is. So with such mass increase in population, and then there's a requisite to always be connected and have ubiquitous smart devices, there's a need and a mandate for technology space, and that has increased in the most dramatic results in the recent history of human consumption. Um, so we enter this protocol for an ever expanding vehicle for data and linkage. So it deals with this layer of informational engagement, bandwidth accretion. It's created a fullness of data transfer and social engagement that creates a kind of in a conceptual and very impactful layer of information discharge wherever we are. And so there was a prognosis was to have a physical need to fill the increasing surface rupture of the ozone. So it's about information technology inclinations that hypothesize this dramatic increase in the need for media space and those ubiquitous outlets or inputs that I talked about earlier. So it's a bladder device. It has the ability to kind of swell as needed. It's a metric for the acknowledgement of these contrasting but superimposed issues of its envelope fields. So as an architectural hypothesis, it really has two functions. Primarily, it was to physically measure, calculate, and then fill the cavities that continue to open in our ozone. They're like floating laboratories. And then secondarily, it critically measures, records, maps, and then reconfigures itself based on our rapidly increasing technology, media engagement, and usage. And so it was really intended to be a political vessel. It could probably be described as a messenger or kind of a conscientious objector. Definitely not an architecturally resolved project, but kind of like a herald of inquiry. Um, so it physically would expand to fill the holes in the ozone, just as it expands to measure the amount of consumptive communication and resource needs we have. The idea that there would be an array of many millions of these things floating above the earth in kind of this sadly needed expanding network. And eventually, as each of the cells started to expand to a maximum volume, they would link and merge with all their adjacent cells until the ozone became a completely artificial construct. And so at that point, physically and conceptually, it is the cloud, right? So it became the thing that protects our ozone, but it also became the ultimate reservoir of all of our digital data. So it literally became the cloud. In terms of other information, the next project's the Tree Hugger. This was a series of, it started out as graphic experiments that really kind of explored the nature of architecture as both a literal and symbolic reading device. So this thing remapped analog drawing data and then translated them into digital diagrams. It it started to explore the possibilities when the digital and the analog world, even through the best intentions, they really didn't establish a firm handshake. So in fact, it's a scanner, but it's a scanner that scans the relationships between drawings and their physical political implications. It's a transmitter, but it's one that sends signals to the space between architecture and its media, which is where most of my work lives. It's also an awareness amplifier, but it's one that attempts to ignite the conversation about our media and its implications. So this tree hugger also serves as a device that operates between two additional systems. So that of the natural environment and its occupants, the trees, and this projected synthetic variant, the Southern California cell tower mimic that I showed before. You could make an argument that the green nature of the Southern California landscape is itself synthetic, but the situation of flora is a condition that reflects an occurrence of a biological condition. So physically, this thing would scan and map and examine things like deforestation maps, cell tower location diagrams, archival texts that recorded kind of haunted archaeologies of gerrymandering and landscape reconfigurations, power line boulevards, and plots of topography legislation. So it was conceptually mapping the parallel and contradictions of this residual space and the artifact between those two systems. And it kind of inhabits the metrics of simultaneous hidden technologies of the map it reads and then the transmission lines that it might follow. So this next series of projects, these are unpublished, but Tom Main, Los Angeles architect, Pritzker Prize winner, incredible influence, and now a friend of mine, did these groundbreaking projects in the 80s. It was Sixth Street House where he lived, and then did these theoretical drawings, which I think are in SF MoMA. And through a project that I was working on, I decided to humbly deface these drawings, to use the drawings as a media integration point to start creating another kind of project. So I'm in an international drawing group. We've published several books, and we're all over the world. We get together every 3 to 6 months to discuss our work, to put on exhibitions, to do lectures, to do publications. So we met at a gallery a couple years ago. It's called Gallery A83 in New York City. It was the warehouse in the 80s of where all the big name architects went to get their prints done. Nichols was the guy. So our task when we met at this gallery was to each pick an artifact from the gallery, a silkscreen, and to do a drawing that responded to it. So I picked Tom Main Morpheus' Sixth Street House project. So it occurs in 7 different kind of interventions. First was plan and section introductory. So you can see the plan on the left, and then my kind of incredibly timid, frightened, if you will, interjection. These subtle insertions of kind of this sympathetic information. I was trying to match the graphic nature of the plan, trying to honor the graphic nature. I was trying to be ultra conservative in my wishes not to really deface these historic artifacts. And I was also trying very hard not to offend a mentor and a friend who made these. And I showed them to Tom, and he's very gracious. And he said, these are too tame, which was a shock to me, but it also it opened up an opportunity for me to, and he was very right, they were tame. It opened up an opportunity for me to get a little bit more experimental. So I went through a recalibration. I started to recognize that I was just kind of barely inhabiting the space between architecture and its drawing. And I wanted to recognize that there was this intellectual space that resided between building and drawing. So I started with this creation of a mythology of these architectural devices that both inhabit the realm of the situational architectural condition, which is the building, and then the space of the drawing itself. I think these initial ones did an okay job of occupying both spaces independently, the building and the drawing, but they were yet to define or inhabit this actual space that occurred between them. And so I was just starting to examine the original drawing as a site of experimentation. So these interventions began to develop this autonomy and this agency that operated on top of the drawing data. They started to adopt a fluidity of occupancy, and they created 3 distinct spatial conditions. So that of the drawing, that of its implied construction or the building, because they're separate things, and the conceptual space that occurred on top of or in between these sublayers. So then the next phase was the residual constructs. So I took this drawing series that I had come up with, and I removed the original drawings. I removed all of the Morpheus drawings, and I just started looking at these residual configurations that were left once the original context was denied. I was looking at new relationships between events that were never meant to coexist as new spatial prototypes, not too dissimilar from the idea of dead technology elements that were being implanted into the existing house when Tom did the project originally. And that created this residue's own set of original context data, and it gave me opportunities to play arrangements off of each other to see what kind of spatial variants and constructs might emerge in an active search for new relationships. And then I started to look for variant options for conflict, friction, and opportunities for line politics. places where conflict didn't resolve, but where it opened dialogues for harmonies and misalignments. That's where I like to dwell. I find the places in spatial experiments where conflict happens. That's the birthplace for new ideas, and that's really where I like to kind of play around. The next phase was taking the actual physical print and doing an intervention. So I took the physical silkscreen prints, and I kind of established three levels of abstraction. So we were looking at the physical prints themselves. The physical prints were made from line drawings, which are completely different entities, and those line drawings were documents of an architecture, which was completely different. And this gave birth to kind of a new typology and a relational structure for me, which allowed me to have variants and new conversations and ideas, kind of exploring the implied frame and expressed field, which gave me options really to kind of, as an artist, play around with background, midground, and foreground relationships that you couldn't do with the building, opportunities to go past the physical and metaphorical boundaries of any of the three original states, which kind of pointed me back to the original composite. So go back to the original hybrid. So originally, Tom took 11 pieces of technology or other pieces of architecture, dead tech, and he inserted them in the building. And this drawing is a composite of all the pieces that were inserted in the building. They're not in the place where they were in the building. They're in a place to have a harmonious relationship as a drawing. So it's drawing geography versus building geography. And so this drawing may make no sense in terms of construction, but it makes complete sense in terms of the relational strategies that was found within the media of the architecture. So I took a piece all the way over on the left, the little staircase and the wall that came with it, and I started looking at its position within the drawing versus its position within the architectural geography. And then I started looking at the nature of the foreign media that was used to give it autonomy. I used this unrelated drawing I was working on for another project to kind of influence a method of extraction, sequencing of strategy, and looking at relational opportunities where scalar issues didn't matter anymore. So I isolated the assembly from the original, pursued its internal geometries and its spatial and graphic dialogues between these two drawings of the same component. And keep in mind that this data only occurs between these isolated components and assemblies. And then I unsuccessfully reinserted the new artifact back into a set of altered media states, just trying to see if these insertions told me anything about my original hypotheses, which led to this discovery of this idea of reinsertions. So I went back to the original drawings and churned out a new series of typologies, trying to generate new ways of inserting systems and notational fields or objects either into or onto the original drawings as a way of developing spatial prototypes that weren't present in the originals. In this case, the poche, the black, which is the building section where it's cut through, I started playing around with it as a way to create a graphic condition that could not be physically possible within an architecture drawing. Here also the notational, the annotative space, these fields begin to develop their own autonomy as well, which we'll talk about in a moment. And the hope was that these new interventions or these defacing of the original set of drawings would venture past that tame observation that Tom had so appropriately given the first one. These synthetic offspring of variational structures became architectural systems they're no longer fixed, but they're always contingent, they're always adaptive. And this is where technology, or at least the technology of architectural representation, turns inward, where the idea that the machine is no longer an object, but a condition. It's a medium of perpetual reconfiguration. And so these aren't machines of efficiency. They are, in fact, machines of disruption, objects that exist between categories and hopefully that defy typology. And these were opportunities to kind of progress past the initial architectural media I made by using the drawing and not the architecture as a site of experimentation. And that led to what I'm calling a new species. And there's just a couple of these, but the idea of isolating the machine interventions from their original sites, removing them, starting to explore the relationships between them, as well as the notion of creating a catalog of what I'm calling an alternative speciesism of all the parts that I had used in the previous drawings. Um, I started discovering new spatial relationships that started a journey to create and analyze a new design language for me. And these new species have started to create, inhabit their own notational fields, their own graphic data that is both of themselves as well as has cues back to the original site drawings, which are no longer there. The next category was a condition I'm calling field spatiality. And so for me, it was a logical step to take these objects and remove them and just look at the annotative fields that were left as spatial opportunities, as objects and systems themselves. And so I kind of re-entered this loop stream to start to look at variants and subvariants and offspring series and mutated gestations, playing around kind of the idea of being my own AI engine to explore an infinite number of tangents of these initial data sets that I had created. So most of these early drawings, they were generated from a series of 5 or 6 data sets, and I was just iterating different ways of looking them to come together with the idea that there would be an infinite way, a number of doing this. Those started to give birth to their own kind of non-notational offspring, which kind of completes the circle. It generates a completely autonomous language that's based specifically in initial simple sets of experimental data. Um, and then the last 2 series of the project, I've kind of broken off. So a lot of my current work is looking at architecture as a spatial or political ventriloquist, which led me to start looking at things like informal puppetry, graphic marionettes, mimicry agencies, surrogate drawing devices where a placeholder object of one component, its function is to delegate the execution to one or more other objects that it controls access to, like a ventriloquist, allowing the placeholder to carry out others' processing before and after that action. And so I started looking at the ventriloquist and the dummy, and I was asking questions like how much is the ventriloquist figure about the hand and the mouth operation, and how much of it is about this cross-modal phenomenon of throwing one's voice. Um, how much of the act of ventriloquism is about watching the figure have that cross-modal moment, and how much of it is about the observation of a lack of motion from the author or the orator's mouth. And then questioning, are these kind of modes of stimuli interchangeable? Can we make analogous connections between auditory and visual phenomenon? So kind of a segue, I jumped out of the computer. I went to this paper folding exercise where I took some text that I had written, started folding, increasing, and cutting based on the geographies and geometries of the text, jumped back into the digital world to create annotative fields to understand the kind of maneuvers that I made. And then at that point, I've kind of had a breakthrough because it was the idea of the text that was generated becoming the context itself, temporarily trading the role of the context of the text with the geographical placements as a way of initiating site responsiveness. So previously, I would make an object, I would generate text and notational fields from the objects. In these, the texts came first and they became this spatial generator. So I started looking at old drawings and old text as kind of context fields that I could generate devices that looked like they were responding to or creating those texts. Kind of referencing and the ideas of culture of technology and media spaces within architecture. And so you get these semi-organic mechanical events that they create their own set of general rules for their own duplication or integration into logical systems that are exterior to themselves. They kind of occupy this really curious space that exists between folds of scale, time, structure, Cartesian rules, and even typical biological sequencing. These things can be everywhere, they can be nowhere, and more importantly, they're a smeared state space that exists between 2 phases or states. They have no borders, yet they can define system of edges as they see fit, and they're capable of blurring set boundaries of adjacent objects. They kind of graphically create and destroy their own DNA. So I started dealing then with issues as spatial prosthetics, of architectural cyborgs, and augmented realities. I was playing around with the idea of maybe the next step, and this is way out of my field, but maybe the next step in learning machines might be the emergence of what I'm calling AC, which is an artificial cell that has the embodiment of AI learning, but it's the machine, the computer, the brain, and the cell all occurring simultaneously, but starting to abandon the edges of autonomy occurrences. And so I started asking myself these questions, larger questions like, what are these new types of architectural spatial happenings that might occur as a result of these experiments? There's kind of this new DNA that could create mutated ghost scripts that might introduce chaotic randomness into generative prompts. They're both typos and typos, so sort of non-text-based generative learning scripting, or maybe the idea of generative soul scripting, or the idea of projected and transmitted consciousness. And I mean, ultimately, it becomes about drawing on top of drawings, but I think more importantly, it becomes about the space that happens between media and its awareness. If I'm looking at the drawing as a site of experimentation, it's about the insertion of the genotext in or onto the phenotext, offering a space that allows the media space to come into being. And if we're starting to approach a true machine learning protocol, I'm wondering graphically, architecturally, if software might inherit or kind of start building consciousness, that and have this kind of developed sense of authorship. And then, if so, could they develop their own architectural language? And could AI develop its own pursuit of beauty, whatever that is? Or would it just simply reflect all the documentation of digitized or virtual expressions? Or would it not even register in the human's awareness of form, space, and disorder? Um, so if we look at, my book is called Speculative Coolness. So if we look at thoughts on coolness of media and speculation, cold media requires high levels of user interaction in order to be complete or have a larger layer or condition of understanding from a reader or a user or an occupant. So these architectural proposals and the speculative coolness, I hope, do in fact require greater amounts of occupant interaction to complete the circuit, to activate the system, and to create the architectural event space. Um, Coolness has been also used to describe something that's intriguing or unique, something that tests the depths of expression and imagination that we commonly define ourselves to. So speculating on coolness also could refer to the inquiry of the placement of these extreme architectural proposals into the fabric of the discipline or the profession. And then when we start looking again at the technology of culture, it revives a mobile structure and distribution of devices that I was talking about. They also they also project culture as well as artificial organic systems of recording. So it's about the artifacts, it's about their operating systems, and it's about this hybridization of the two. And then where I start asking more questions again, what is the difference of these two things? Where is the segregation? Where and how thick might the overlap might actually be? So things that I was considering as these drawings start to emerge, things like systems of production, hierarchy of social segregation, high speed, low speed, or no speed, types of systems of control, things being watched or things watching, Truman's World, curated versus uncurated data, handcrafted news or levels of truth, and fake news machines and their distribution devices. And so there's this idea of always being connected. And in so I find it interesting when you look at social media that there's this power of personal statements and videos that only typically show one side or one view, but that are immediately accepted as truth by so many so fast. It's kind of a desensitization of society through the saturation of media on call. And so I started to question the role of, especially for generations that have been raised in the social media appliance age, what might the term higher power mean and what searches for truth might be. I think for me, the inquiry has become to explore the condition of this deity and pious iconography in a time and arena where kind of everything is assumed to be known. And it seems that there's kind of this movement towards this quasi-religious experience and then therefore space. You've got belief systems and faith and non-tangible technology entities that seem incredibly high. I started to look at the drone as a condition of pure social and architectural media, with the assumption of the voyeur that being watched was being real, that it wasn't staged, or it wasn't, at very least, not affected by the introduction of this supplanted external viewing device. It's a system that's impacted by the awareness of the presence of the camera. Um, in this case, when I look at the condition of drone politics, I think the drone becomes as much as a drawing device as my pencil or my mouse might be. And so then the work starts to question synthetic chronologies. There are these systems of artificial references, these fabricated timestamps, artifacts of purposely simulated occasions that often contradict each other in plain ice. So if I were to quote the Oracle from Matrix Revolutions upon the changing of her appearance between the films, I'm sorry I couldn't be sitting here like you remember me, but it wasn't meant to be. Yeah, that's how it works. Some bits you lose, some bits you keep. I don't yet recognize my face in the mirror, but I still love candy. So, yeah, I'm not gonna talk about these. So formation of information, the text, the father of the prompt, has the ability to inhabit the physicality of the drawing. It's a set of directions for making space, but as a spatial system itself, it's supposed to kind of break the shackle of the legible message, transcending the place, the location, and the definition of linguistic information. It's not only that data has space, but it's that data is space. And the last thing I'm going to show you, this drawing group, we got together at the beginning of the summer and we took a text, Georges Perec's, an attempt at exhausting a place in Paris, and we were meant to do a research project based on it. And so I'm in the middle of this. This is just kind of starting out for me. I had a hip replacement over the summer, so I officially have been welcomed to the world of being a cyborg. And I noticed when the surgeon was mapping the prosthetic out before the surgery, which is the image in the middle, that there was the idea of this prosthetic, this implant, but there was also the idea of this aesthetic, which is the graphic insinuation of the prosthetic. And so I came up with this term, the proaesthetic, which is the space between the implant and its graphic residue. So I just started taking all of the information I could in this text. Perec went to this cafe near the Saint-Sulpice Chapel in Paris and started recording all the non-things, pigeons, people walking back and forth, buses, things that weren't permanent. And so I started scouring the text that we were given and looked for the bits of information that I could extract. And I just took this one page, for example, and so I was looking kind of the cadence mapping of the buses, because this is how we list the buses going through the site. And then kind of giving things a graphic signifier, looking for numerical references in the text, and starting to look at the extraction. What is the genotext versus the phenotext? And I noticed that on the handout they gave us, somebody had put it on a scanner, and the pages weren't exactly straight, and even between the pages of the book there was a shift. And I thought that was kind of an interesting, since we're supposed to be looking at non-things, we're supposed to be looking at the text. I was looking at the space between the text. And then I did a little digging and discovered that at Saint-Sulpice there was an original chapel there that was built over top of, that originally had a skew. So I found this idea of this skew to be kind of important. And so I started creating this idea of this rotation, which talks about the rotation of the hand turning the page, the action of putting the book on the scanner, the rotation of the items of delivery. So I started extracting the different geometries of the page. I went through and I hand traced the geometries of the lines of text and the breaks of the text, and generated this kind of basic diagram. And then once I removed the context, started playing around with what happens if you looked at the relationships between these things. Again, this is all like a month or so old. This is all fresh. I'm still in the process of figuring it out. Wanted to create what I've been calling these storm drawings with that individual data. Then I moved on to create, since there were pigeons in the square, flying back and forth and in circles. I wanted to make this pigeon coop or pigeon co-op, a place where pigeons would come in, people would observe them. We would supplant pigeons. We would build robotic pigeons and then supplant some of them with AI observations. So when the roost went back out, we could observe the pigeons in their natural habitat as being a pigeon. And then I started looking at maybe the pigeon migration itself becoming this idea of the prosthetic or an immigration machine. So this is an example of what the pigeon coop is starting to look like. And then since I'm not ultimately interested in the object, I'm interested in the media, I started doing some drawing experiments, first of the object, and then I started removing the object. And this is kind of where I am doing a recent drawing that looks at all the data sets with the removal of the object, which has generated these data sets. And then the ultimate goal is I did this with a previous project. I generated an object. I put it on a wooden base. I projected all of its geometries and its relationships. I removed it. I produced this residue. I put the object back on the base and then let the graphic residue project back onto the object to transform the object. And from that, I started generating a set of drawings that were not only about the object on the base, but the fact the base was a box and it had 6 sides and it had multiple surfaces. So here's some analog drawings that were done from that object. It's my goal to do it with the chicken coop, and so I just started working with somebody to do some 3D modeling. These are some early studies. It gets me back to the idea of technology, of the technology, architecture becoming an implant device itself. And then the last two drawings, this is another implant insertion experiment where I'm taking the raw data and implanting it on top of itself to see if there's a new kind of spatial language I can come up with. Similar, looking at the prosthetic, the graphic implant, creating the kind of the storm drawings. So this is the last image. I want to thank you for paying attention. It's really difficult to attempt the spatialization of things and matters that were maybe never meant to be seen or talked about or included in the physicality of our world. And I think they're residues of more important things, maybe even than architecture. So thank you very much. And if there's time or if there's any questions, I'm happy to attempt to take any.
Thank you, Professor Cantley, for your talk.
Sure.
I actually have a question. So I was kind of wondering, sort of what you see as the relationship between drawings and models, because my understanding is you don't always turn everything into a model. And so I'm kind of curious as to what your like selection criteria is, or what does that change about the drawing if you're going to turn it into a model?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting of the phrasing that you used. So typically in an architectural process where we're designing a building, you would generate a set of drawings that you would turn into models. I look at drawings and models as being the media of architecture, the representation of architecture, and therefore I don't look at them in a linear fashion. So I don't necessarily go from drawing to model. Sometimes I go from model to drawing. Sometimes I go back and forth, parts of model, parts of drawing, parts digital, parts analog. I look at them as they're all tools, they're all media tools that allow us to observe and speculate on different things than other forms of media. So a physical model is going to allow me to explore things that a digital model isn't, and a digital model is going to allow me to explore things that a physical drawing wouldn't. There's not really a hierarchy. There's definitely not a linearity. They're just all forms of representational media that offer a different part of the complete conversation.
I see. Thank you.
I have a question, if that's okay. Does my mic work?
Yeah, please go ahead.
Sorry. Yes. So my field is an art field to begin with. It's not architecture, but I do see like some thematical similarities, at least with one artist that I really like. It's Cronenberg.
Right.
Between his and your work, at least what I noticed at the beginning of your talk. The part that brought my eye in terms of that, it's like at the beginning you were showing like these models of like this sort of synthetics, mixes of machine and flesh,
Mhm.
as like analogs for like social anxieties and also like and at the same time as machines of disruption. And I was thinking, of course, as Cronenberg, like in my film, it's that's my media, that's my field. I mean, how like in each era that he made a film, like say Videodrome, the machine of disruption was TV, of course, like how it can brainwash people, I guess, and the social anxiety of like porn, I guess, in that time. And then you have existence where VR and only video games were the machines of disruption to him, and how like it could like literally like mix between like the video game and the human body. And now his latest film, I believe it's Crimes of the Future, where the machine of disruption, in this case being pollution, and how like the human body in a way sort of adapts to it by becoming like a mutant. I was thinking like the way you like portray like how social anxiety is not only like change our world like an environment, but also like the bodies itself. I don't know what it was to ask exactly, but is there something about it in your work regarding it?
Regarding the change of the body as an adaptable entity, I'm not sure.
Yes, I guess that's more or less my point. Like, if you see
Yeah,
something along those lines.
yeah. I mean, I think um, it's a very large question. I think when we look at machines or art or architecture or media or our bodies or society, I'm probably not going to answer your question. Um, when we get to a point where we become unadaptable, it's impossible for us to look at new problems, new frictions, new relationships, and we can't address them, then that's when those components die, and that's when they become less effective and eventually just kind of fade out. And um, I'm going to use the word evolution, however you want to read that. Evolution allows for bodies or entities that are adaptable to be the ones that are going to progress, and the ones that cannot adapt are going to get segregated and eventually die off. So, if your question is that important? Does my work speak about that? And I don't know if that's your question, but if it is, I would say that most definitely all of the responses are political, social, societal responses to issues that we've got that if we can successfully, I'll just say even acknowledge or address, not even necessarily solve, because that some of those might be impossible. But if we can start addressing those, then we have the ability to progress as a society. And if we don't solve those problems, maybe we come up with a different configuration that would address them and provide a different political, social response, so that those problems, they're not so much solved, but they kind of fade away because they don't exist anymore. So that, I think ultimately that's a large layer of what my work is about. Yeah, not proposing actual solutions, because I live in a fantasy world. Everything's theoretical, everything's fantastical, but with the hopes that people that read about it or see it or experience it would walk away having dialogues with themselves and other people about the topics. And so these things all are more kind of like seed planters, that they're meant to propagate discourse among observers to go out and hopefully figure out solutions or other methods of kind of working with these frictions. That's a really long way, I think, of avoiding your questions.
No, no, no. It's actually like a very interesting what you said because um, the term of evolution not being like a perfect solution, but more like a workaround that actually works. It actually kind of works in the question I asked us. Like, if you watch Crimes of the Future, in the end, like people evolve to like eat plastic because the problem is like pollution per se. It's
What
not
was the name?
perfect.
What was the name of the film again?
Crimes of the Future,
Price of the Future. Okay.
crimes as in illegal. Yeah, no, no. Thank you very much. It's a very good response. Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate the question.
I had the kind of question along similar lines. Um, so your prosthetic idea reminds me a lot of Lebbe's Woods,
Mm,
and he has treated. Oh, sorry. Yeah. He famously didn't. He has this proposal about the Yugoslavian war, where he didn't want to rebuild the buildings as they were, but he wanted to preserve the scars.
yes.
And in the previous talk by Alan Kay, he mentioned the idea of like living systems, and in my field. Complexity. We talk a lot about David Krakauer, who is president of SFI Institute, Santa Fe Institute. He gives a definition of teleonomic matter, so goal directed but without intent.
Mm.
And I was wondering, and he identifies pillars such as like entropy, computation, and evolution. Um, at the core. And so I was wondering how far architecture can be understood in this way. Because there is like this question, we study culture, but culture is not designed. It's kind of product of more similar to biology. But then when we talk about technological systems, each part is usually very intentionally designed, and but systems like internet, most of our infrastructure is so large that it cannot be pre-planned, and it constantly suffers some kind of change and alteration from all of those distributed sources. And I was kind of wondering about like how does that work with architecture? And when you talk about these kind of synthetic ecologies, do you mean ecologies of representations of like media, not instantations? Or if you're aiming at the material ecology where artifacts are like living systems, and is you mentioned like genotext and phenotext and kind of taxonomy of this, and it really interests me how you construct that parallel.
Well, yeah, thank
Thank
you.
you.
That's a very, very complicated question. I like where it's going. Yeah, the geno and the phenotext, I think, are a partial response to Leb's, the scar cities, which was obviously a huge influence, and a very unique way of looking at the result of these violent, impactful deconstruction acts. You made an interesting comment that culture is not designed, that it's maybe you said it was learned, or I don't remember the word that you used, but it's in terms of architecture. And again, I don't build anymore. I gave that up a long time ago to do theoretical, mainly looking at these residues mainly through what architectural media can do. But I wonder, I mean, it seems to me almost that I'll call it experimental architecture. So architectural that's not meant to solve necessarily a given problem in a economically feasible way, right? I'm not going to do an addition to my house, right? But experimental architecture could not necessarily solve problems, but I think if it's done correctly, and I think Lebbeus was at the threshold for this, that it could ask new questions about new systems and new ecologies and new methodologies, so that in a sense, I think our experimental architecture does it a lot. Maybe real architecture could do it in the future, where culture, anytime somebody does a theoretical project, I think culture is being designed. I could make an argument that my work are posing questions that if they were to be built in some fictitious world, the occupants or the inhabitants or the users, possibly even the observers, would start to generate a new cultural phenomena that would be a resultant of the media aggregation and the formal scarring or implanting, in my case, into the world. So yeah, I don't think I mean, culture is kind of a funny word, and it can be used in a lot of different ways, and we usually get in trouble when we issue that word because somebody else misinterprets it. But I think we have the ability as, and I don't know who everybody here is, but artists and designers, thinkers, to play with the notion of hybridized and generative cultures as opposed to the culture that's handed down, that's translated through narrative, that's passed on within closed groups. But maybe there's opportunities within this technology infusion, and if we have the ability of evolving past that we can transcend the kind of basic human form with new ways of thinking, that I would say that we all are going to be potentially doing culture designed or yeah, culture scripting maybe might be a different world. And this is so far not in my wheelhouse at all, but I like thinking of my work, of experimental work. It's why I like Libya so much, a huge influence, that when you read his work and when you look at his work and you observe it, at least I did, I think a lot of people do. It sounds like maybe you did as well. You walk away kind of tilting your head, not looking at things the same way, which ultimately has to be the seed for either the advancement of existing cultures and the we talked about it earlier, the adaptation of culture, and or more importantly, the evolution, the generation of new sculptures. So sorry, cultures. You could take culture and adapt it and let it evolve. So we're talking revolution as well as evolution. Did I don't know if I addressed what you were talking about. It's a great question because there's so many wheels that are going. It's hard for me to formulate a specific singular response.
Thank you. Yes, I mean, what you talked about is very enlightening, and I would say that like my question was very broad, so there was like a lot of angles to address it from. So I would say it answered my question.
It was a
But
very, very interesting set of questions. I really appreciated those. Thank you.
thank you.
That actually reminds me of what Eugenia said and what you said, where in terms of like Lebbeus Woods' work, where there's this kind of revolutionary potential. And I kind of wonder, like, I guess, how far do you see that with your own work? Like, like discourse versus revolution. I mean, I think Woods had this whole, conception of like, architecture in a completely different way. And I'm kind of wondering to what extent, I guess it's kind of like, what do you want other people to take away? I guess that's kind of my question. That was motivated by the conversation.
Yeah, that's a very fair question. I don't know if I have a set of detailed or specified takeaways. I would hope, and this is going to be very generalized, that and I don't really think of it that often in terms of people outside architecture until things like this happen today. So this has been really good for me because it gets me out of the jargon discipline centric world that I tend to live in. I think what I typically have done, and the reason that I wrote both books was to begin to give. Well, let me back up. So when I was a student, I grew up in North Carolina, and went to the University of North Carolina, very conservative, pragmatic. If you're an architect, you're going to get out and you're going to design buildings that clients want. End of story. And in undergraduate school, I discovered, Lebbeus Woods, Zaha, Morphosis, people like this that started to allow me to think of not just the profession of architecture, but the bigger picture, the discipline of architecture. So my goal would be that students in particular, but anyone that would be exposed to the work would start to look at their own work as, and this is very ambitious, not being solution based, but being inquiry based. I mean, it's cliche, but questions or sorry, answers bore me. Questions are much more interesting. I tend to, when I'm writing things for lectures, I tend to, think of all the questions that came up, and I tend to throw those out there as unanswered questions because they somewhat become less interesting once you come up with an answer to them. I love open-ended systems, so I like questions that generate other questions that generate other questions. So my goal would be that if someone encounters my work, they would walk away kind of scratching their head, thinking about things not in the norm, other questions that they might ask to change their situation or the situation around people around them, especially if they're going to be designers or artists or architects, where they're going to be creating culture or creating artifacts or events that could have a way to propagate new hybrid streams of culture and response. And then ultimately, if we look at the pragmatics of it, I'm interested in the discourse of architectural media and representation. So I would hope that students especially would start having conversations about the way that they represent architecture, and that might lead them to new ways of thinking about architecture. I don't know if that ever happens. I mean, that's kind of presumptuous to assume that one puts something out there in the world and somebody responds to it and a new way of thinking happens. I'm not going to do that, but that would be my kind of overall goal, I think.
Yeah, thank you.
Sure.
If we have time for one more question.
Yeah. Yeah, go ahead.
Could you please elaborate on genotext and phenotext? Those terms really intrigue me, and
yeah, in terms of the in terms of some of my older projects where I was taking original architecture drawings of known pieces of architecture, like I did with Morphos's drawings. If I stripped it down, the phenotext is the original body of information. In this case, text, drawing, it's media, so they're kind of interchangeable. The genotext is the bit of information that is placed on top of is the best way to say it, although it's not correct spatially, on top of the original drawing to create a new kind of text or new kind of information. So it's just a way of labeling that which exists and has standards and rules, that which is superimposed to that, bringing its own set of standards and rules, with the idea that those standards and rules of each of the layers can start to inform and deform the conversation they have between each other, creating a third layer. That's the really boiled down, probably wrong use of the terms, but that's how I think about it in terms of my work. The drawing on top, it's a palimpsest or a yeah, where you're drawing on top of another drawing, you're discovering information, and then or a pentimento where you're putting something on top of something else to generate a new kind of understanding, but you're not negating the first one, you're working with the first one and negating parts of it.
No, that makes a lot of sense to me. Thank you for answering that. That reminds me of autoencoders and systems where something is like contemporary artificial intelligence that works by embedding things into kind of geometric latent space, and then it generates by decoding these kind of distributional relationships of this geometric object. And this principle seems to just repeat a lot across different systems. Kind of this, there's also like a theory of culture by Stuart Hall, encoding decoding theory, where it's just a frame to look at the culture as a like just process of reinterpretation, but it is kind of mediated by these memory constraints, and abstraction is this works as this kind of classification. So in a sense, like these constraints on memory and on representation create abstraction, and then decoding these abstractions back into artifacts kind of is this creative process.
Right, exactly. Yep. Of course, yeah, thank you.
And I think we're going to stop this right here. So thank you very much for being here.
Thank you, everybody. I appreciate it.